They're sort of inherent. They can't, for the volunteers, they can't build anything that's 2-story. So they're all, and it's not like they're just.
He doesn't. He just knows.
Buildings that fit in the character of the. So there's a niche for them. Yeah, they're doing good work.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
He knows it pretty well.
And then if you go around.
We were thinking about it a little bit.
We can change that.
Can you?
Yeah, we'll go check.
Yeah, she definitely said food in there.
Thank you.
Oh,
This, it looks like we're live.
Yes, we are.
Oh, we are live. Oh, fantastic. Okay, team. Well done.
You're more live.
Okay. You are such a trooper. Thank you. So we're back from an intentional break. Okay, and so we're gonna keep going here. All right, thank you.
Okay, for the record, again, I'll say I'm Karina Daly, restoration ecologist with Vermont Natural Resources Council. And we are looking at Connolly Pond Dam removal. So this was a site up in Shrewsbury, a headwater wetland. And we had to do an emergency drawdown on this dam before we actually could remove the dam because it was a hazard for the community downstream. And I just wanted to show this drone footage because I think it's really beautiful to see. Once we drew down all that water behind the dam, because this was a big pond, the wetlands that are coming through, the little tributaries and streams that were under that pond. So that wetland was suffocated, full of water. And when we took out that dam, that headwater wetland, all that groundwater seep is going back into that stream that's moving downstream. Ultimately, we took out the earthen dam, so the imagery looks a little different now. So it's just an example of a freshwater system reconnected. And a headwater system. And this was an important tributary to the Mill River for brook trout spawning. This is another project in Northfield on the Dog River, Cross Brothers Dam, that we're currently working on with FEMA funds. And this shows before and after. So we often do renderings to help the community visualize what it would look like without the dam. So we haven't actually removed the dam yet, but this is a rendering of what it will look like. I wanted to include this example because the engineering design, the preliminary engineering design shows that removing this dam will lower the flood elevation for 10 homes, the 100-year flood elevation for 10 homes by 2 feet. So these are homes, this area has flooded historically. So changing the flood elevation by 2 feet for 10 homes is a much better investment economically than buying out two. So this dam removal will cost approximately $1 million. We're still, whereas buying out, 2 homes through FEMA post flooding is a similar price tag. So this is an excellent investment, and we're working to remove this one with the support of FEMA. And this is my last slide, and it's just going back to what I said in the beginning, is thinking about our freshwater systems at the watershed scale. From up on Mount Mansfield is one picture, all the way looking to Lake Champlain. So we really need to think of reconnecting these systems and restoring function, natural function to our rivers. And with that, I will just leave it at that. And thanks for listening to me, and sorry for all the back and forth. And if you have any questions, we can do that, or I'll pass it over to the chair.
Any questions for Karina? I want to come back to this last point that you made about that it's more economical to reconnect floodplains than to buy out homes. So I think we can just assume that more flooding is going to happen moving on into the future. I mean, we're 2 for 2 over the last 2 years in terms of devastating flooding. So could you tell us a little bit about and if happy to like ask this question later, or if you have an answer later,
Yeah.
that's okay. But something that would be wonderful to hear about is particularly how the funding works to put together a project to reconnect a floodplain. Yeah.
It's piecemeal, it's a puzzle, and there's an art to it, but it's rare that you can only use one funding source. So it's leveraging funds from multiple sources, a combination of federal, state, and local funds, because often the federal funds require match at the state or local level. There are different funding buckets depending on the priority. The 3 buckets of funding for removing dams and floodplain restoration and wetland restoration is fish passage is one. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Vermont Fish and Wildlife support these projects if they provide restored fish passage for priority species. Brook trout being the priority species in Vermont, but sturgeon is also, one that's considered in wood turtle. Flood resilience. So FEMA provides funding for these projects if they show a flood resilience benefit. And that's not just removing a high hazard dam to save a community. It's also removing a dam that may have increased floodplain reconnection above it. So it's not the dam itself is going, if it fails, is going to impact a community. But by removing that dam, we are restoring, half a mile of floodplain that then river has access to in the future. So that's a tremendous flood resilience benefit. And then the last bucket of funding is water quality. So, removing these dams and restoring wetlands and floodplains for water quality. And sometimes the projects meet all 3 of those buckets and we can leverage funds that way. Sometimes they don't. So it's really a process. And it takes time, applications, and we have to raise funds at each phase of the project. So design versus implementation. And the projects don't move faster than 3 years. And 3 years is like sort of the norm, but it can be up to some of these big projects we're working on for 10 years.
And just want to follow up to that, because some of these projects require a state or local match. Is it your sense that we are leaving money on the table federally for projects for lack of either state or federal, or state or local match?
I would say the hardest is that 25% match with FEMA to meet that. So often the FEMA funds we, aren't able to prioritize because we don't have that 25% local match. And it depends on the community. It could be a 90-10 depending on where you are in Vermont of match, but I think that is the case.
Okay, that is really good to know. Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
thank you. Super. Any other questions for? Okay, thank you so much. So we do have, looks like a couple minutes here before.
I am so hesitant to stop.
Okay. No, what if we keep it live?
It's gonna stay live. I can't even
That is
figure out how to
okay.
shut the sound off either right now. Because it's so.
Well, we'll have a,
just be cautious.
that's fair. Okay, so we'll have an informal break until 10:30, which is when Secretary Moore and some other folks from the state are going to be here to tell us about the Clean Water Initiative. So mics are still hot, but we'll just hang out or do what you need.
Did they replace our TV?
This is hard. They ordered us a new TV. There's obviously something going on.
Something is wrong with that. I am going to take the opportunity to go back.
Oh,
I'll be
okay.
back. Thank you.
No problem. No problem.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Very helpful. Oh, you're here. Maybe we should just.
Secretary Moore, we are still live because of all the technical things we've had, so just don't say anything.
Well, just like your why.
Or no poorly considered remark.
I'm gonna go to the bathroom. I'm going to get the tag. We can start. Okay.
Thanks, Jude. I'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Finish. My water bottle. Don't forget that. I agree. Good to see you.
Hi, Lauren. Long time no see.
I know. I was last year.
Oh my goodness, you have another.
Yeah, we've got the power of Zoom.
When are you due? Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
real soon. That's exciting.
yeah.
You at the stage where you're ready to be done being pregnant?
Yes, I'm not ready for a baby, so. So
Hey, we're still on the years of guys. We're still on the.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, can you close the door even? Thank you. That's good. That's good.
No, something about job.
Oh, well, Well,
Yeah,
not really. This is just.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nerve wracking.
every time we go one step forward and 2 steps back.
Yeah.
Emily, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're good.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and get my screen share set up while we have a little downtime.
Okay, thanks. Great.
Nice to see you too.
All right. You don't have to log in. We're live.
Amazing.
I just grab my note.
Yeah.
And Emily is on the.
Yes.
On there.
Good morning.
Oh, very good.
Excellent. We can hear you, Emily.
Fantastic. Thanks for accommodating the remote participation. I appreciate it.
Of course. I get started.
Okay,
Yeah. Okay. Welcome. You know us all.
I do.
Okay.
For the record, Julie Moore, I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources, and I'm joined this morning remotely by Emily Bird, who manages our Clean Water Initiative program. And then here in the room with me is Claire Madden, who's the Tracking and Accounting Supervisor in the Clean Water Initiative program. So it's really, from my perspective, exciting to be here this morning and have these folks share our annual Clean Water Performance Report. The report provides this really comprehensive look at the significant investments Vermont is making in clean water and reflects the impacts of literally tens of millions of dollars of federal funds, state dollars, and our ability to leverage that work to accelerate investments, particularly over the last several years, while we have had unprecedented amounts of federal funding available to us in the water space. So we've been making investments in things like refurbishing wastewater systems and addressing CSOs, or combined sewer overflows, improving stormwater management, and supporting the adoption of best management practices on farms and forests. And so in this incredible body of work, I also see some really strong parallels with what is needed for robust climate action. And so just want to plant that seed with all of you as you're listening to this report, both thinking about what it's telling us about clean water investments, but I think some of the lessons it offers for how we approach climate action. Our clean water work is based on a thoughtful implementation strategy that has clear priorities that Emily and Claire will be able to share more about. And it's these priorities that really ensure our investments align with our long-term clean water goals, as opposed to sort of the loudest voices in the room. And I think the last couple of years are a dramatic demonstration of that. Where you'll see we've gone from spending $50 to $60 million a year to about $185 million worth of investment last year as a result of these federal funding initiatives. Every dollar we invest in clean water, we know represents a choice about our priorities. And this performance report really provides this accounting of both how those funds are being deployed, as well as the outcomes that they are able to produce in terms of changes in water quality. And just a little bit of context I love to provide is, as some of you may know, I ran what at the time was called the Clean and Clear program from 2008 to 2011, which is what the Clean Water Initiative program has sort of grown into over time. The final budget I worked on in my tenure in that role, which was FY12, we had put forward a proposal for a little over $1 million in grants and contracts. I also pulled up the first of our clean water performance reports, which was for fiscal 18. And in that year, we invested $2.3 million in just over 50 contracts. And so the idea that we are talking about $185 million successfully deployed this year is an incredible tribute to Emily and the really outstanding team she manages in DEC, as well as the strong network of partners we have that are supporting us in this work. And so with that as context, I think Emily is going to sort of tee it up, and then Clara will get into some of the details of the outputs and outcomes of these investments over the last fiscal year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Secretary Moore. Thank you to the committee for having us in this morning. We really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you. For the record, my name is Emily Bird. I'm the Clean Water Initiative Program Manager at the Agency of Natural Resources. And as Secretary Moore also introduced, I'm joined by my colleague Claire Madden, who's our Tracking and Accounting Supervisor. We're going to start off with a little bit of background context on the Clean Water Initiative Vermont. So I'll walk you through some of the background framework of our clean water work, and then I'm going to hand it over to Claire, who will walk you through the details of this year's performance report. And before I dive in, can you see my slides? Okay.
We can.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. All right. Here we go. So I work in the Clean Water Initiative program, which is within the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation, Water Investment Division. And our team's mission is to align and coordinate clean water efforts statewide, to develop financial and technical resources to implement and sustain projects, and to capture and assess and communicate the progress and impact of clean water efforts. Today's presentation is focused on the performance report, which is a primary function of this third part of our team's mission. We are here to present the report to you, but I just want to acknowledge that this report is really an interagency effort representing the work of across 50 different funding programs with state agencies and federal agency partners. So we play a big role in putting the report together each year. Claire leads the team working across state government and with our federal partners to compile data on an annual basis, do the data analysis, the quality assurance, quality control, and to present this report. So we are representing a whole interagency initiative by presenting to you today. Background context on water quality in Vermont. For the most part, we're very fortunate to have excellent water quality in the state of Vermont. Most of our water bodies are meeting water quality standards. However, some of our water bodies do suffer from excess pollution, and they do not meet water quality standards. And in federal clean water law, the Federal Clean Water Act, there is an expectation that the state of Vermont and all states will assess the quality of our waters. And where a water body does not meet standards, there is a process that's in place called total maximum daily load, where you basically look at the water body, the cause of the excess pollution that's impacting its condition, and identify a pollution reduction that's necessary for that water body to be restored to meeting water quality standards. So you can think of that as a water pollution budget, in other words. And in the state of Vermont, most of the state is covered by these large scale total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, these plans that identify pollution reductions that are necessary to restore water quality. Most of the state is covered by TMDLs addressing nutrient and sediment pollution. And so nutrients are a natural thing in our environment. We rely on it for life, but when they are out of balance, when there's excess pollution that is not the natural balance for the ecosystem, it can cause serious issues. So you're probably familiar with some of the challenges in Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog. About half of the state of Vermont, shown in this map in the dark green, it drains to Lake Champlain. And Memphremagog in the northeast corner of the state. Both of those water bodies are impaired due to excess phosphorus pollution. And excess phosphorus pollution in parts of the lake cause cyanobacteria blooms, or sometimes referred to as blue-green algae. And cyanobacteria blooms can be harmful and sometimes toxic and impact the use and enjoyment of those waters. So we are operating in the state of Vermont under a total maximum daily load that sets targets to reduce phosphorus pollution going into Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog. Also in the eastern side of the state, the Connecticut River Basin, the Connecticut River drains to Long Island Sound, and we're part of a 5-state effort to reduce nitrogen pollution to Long Island Sound, where excess nitrogen in that ecosystem is causing a process that results in extremely low oxygen that causes dead zones in Long Island Sound. So we are part of a 5-state effort that's working with New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York to address nitrogen pollution. And as we are working on implementing these really large scale TMDLs, I also just like to point out that the practices that we are putting into place to address phosphorus and nitrogen pollution and the projects we're supporting with partners on the ground, while we're targeting reductions for these larger water bodies, these projects also have a number of local water quality benefits, and not just water quality benefits, but as Secretary Moore mentioned, flood resilience benefits, habitat restoration benefits, economic benefits. So what water quality and the work we're doing to support water quality really has multiple benefits. And Claire's going to get into that in a little more detail as we dive into the contents of the report. In Vermont, in 2015, the Clean Water Act, the Vermont Clean Water Act, was passed into law. And this is based on the state's commitment to restore Lake Champlain and to meet those phosphorus reduction requirements that were identified in the Lake Champlain TMDL. Because of the rural characteristic of the state of Vermont, most of our pollution sources, when we're talking about water quality, are rain runoff, snow melt driven sources. And we call that non-point source pollution. And most of those sources of pollution are not or were not addressed by regulatory actions. So regulations that would compel actions to reduce water pollution. So the state of Vermont needed to demonstrate to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency that we had sufficient assurances in place that we'd be able to meet the necessary phosphorus reduction targets. And Act 64 was a critical piece of that implementation plan that the state was committing to in order to restore water quality and meet the expectations of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. So while this was really compelled by the work that was needed for Lake Champlain, a lot of the work in Act 64 extends statewide and supports water quality work statewide. And Act 64 put into place additional water quality regulations that would compel actions across multiple land use sectors that were previously not regulated. So required agricultural practices to address non-point source pollution from agricultural fields and pastures. Also additional stormwater regulations to address the stormwater runoff and erosion of our road networks, including the 3-acre general permit that required additional treatments be put into place on parcels that were previously not permitted or permitted under an older standard to address stormwater runoff, bringing pollution from our developed lands into nearby waters. Also, the municipal separate storm sewer system, or MSSER, permit for our more populous communities in Vermont they have specific expectations to implement phosphorus reductions as part of this plan. And then also the municipal roads general permit, which was covered statewide, which requires municipalities to upgrade their road networks to reduce erosion from those road networks. And in the process also brings about additional resilience for those road networks. And then in the forestry sector, the acceptable management practices for logging jobs were updated to address erosion and to minimize erosion from those sites. That's the first big piece of Act 64, was to put into place additional regulations that would provide more assurances that what was otherwise unregulated non-point source pollution would be able to be addressed. And in tandem with those regulations, the state established for the first time its Clean Water Fund. At the beginning, with Act 64, the Clean Water Fund received about $5 million of revenue per year. And now that has increased up to roughly $25 million per year. And the Clean Water Fund is a critical piece of this plan to be able to provide financial assistance and financial incentives to implement the work that's needed to reduce phosphorus loading to Lake Champlain, but then to also support water quality priorities statewide. And so it helps to incentivize non-regulatory actions, but also provides financial assistance to entities that are required to comply with regulations. And then finally, no good plan can be successful without some accountability and the ability for us to track our progress. And so part of Act 64 put into place some pretty substantial tracking, accounting, and reporting requirements, which was the impetus for the performance report that we're presenting to you today. It's not just a report, though. I just want to point out that the data that we're able to compile in partnership with other state agencies and federal agencies on an annual basis is incredibly important to provide transparency and accountability on how we're doing. And it's also a useful planning tool where we're able to track our progress, but also identify where there's gaps and where we need to take a different approach to address those gaps in meeting our goals. So Act 64 was incredibly foundational to this body of work. And then following up Act 64 was Act 76 of 2019 that we have named the Clean Water Service Delivery Act. And building on Act 64, Act 76 put into place additional revenue streams into the Clean Water Fund that brings us to that sufficient funding level that we're operating under today, roughly $25 million a year, with some swings depending on the economic environment. And it also updated the priorities and the suite of grant programs that we are administering to support the clean water work, acknowledging that with this increased amount of funding, we needed to rethink the way that we were administering the funding and getting those dollars out the door. And these new grant programs that were put into place really embrace the partnership on the ground with the local partners that are implementing this work and decentralize a lot of the decision making to the more local scale. And we'll get into a little bit more on how that works in a little bit. But just to run through these 4 new grant programs, we have the Water Quality Restoration Formula grants that are currently targeting phosphorus reductions in the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog basins, where we have clean water service providers that are operating on a watershed scale. So think Winooski River, Missisquoi Bay. They each have their own clean water service provider that is responsible for administering funds and meeting a specific phosphorus reduction target with those funds. And they pass those dollars through to local project implementers that are working in their communities to improve water quality. And that's really focused on compelling the non-regulatory reductions needed. We also have the statewide Water Quality Enhancement Grant Program, and that acknowledges that there's work to be done statewide, not just in Lake Memphremagog and Lake Champlain. So this provides support for non-regulatory projects across the state, focused on water quality, but also has a pretty strong emphasis on watershed resilience and supporting public access to waters. And then the next grant program is the Developed Lands Implementation Grants. That was established to target financial assistance to entities required to comply with the 3-acre general permit and provide financial assistance to them. And then finally, we have the Municipal Stormwater Implementation Grants, and that's a suite of grant programs that are supporting municipal regulatory requirements under Act 64. So really focused on helping municipal 3-acre sites, the MS4 communities in the state of Vermont to meet their phosphorus targets, as well as the financial assistance that's administered by the Agency of Transportation to support towns meeting the municipal road general permit standards. And finally, all of these grant programs are now addressed in Appendix A of the performance report. There are specific reporting requirements for each year. We check in on the progress and administration of these 4 grant programs and whether or not they are sufficiently funded. Tactical basin planning is a pretty critical component of our clean water work. This is the process that the state supports through the watershed planning program in the Agency of Natural Resources. There are watershed planners that are operating for each of the 15 river basins in the state of Vermont. And it's really a community-driven process that is led by DEC, where looking at each of those river basins, so again, think Winooski River or Ottauquechee River, that scale, where they're working with community partners in those watersheds to identify what the priority water quality issues are and what priority actions need to be taken in order to address those water quality challenges. And tactical basin planning also serves as the implementation planning tool for the Lake Champlain TMDL and the Lake Memphremagog TMDL. It is a 5-year rotating cycle that we go through for basin planning, where you start out by looking at what are the priority water quality concerns, what are the actions that need to be taken to address those concerns, and then having a period of implementation where we monitor and assess our progress. And then at the end and partway through, there's a checkpoint to see how did we do, where are there still gaps, what resources do we need to target, whether it be financial or technical assistance to address those gaps. And that process rotates through on a 5-year basis for each of those 15 river basins. So any given year, there's roughly like 3 basin plans that are up for reassessment. All right. And then the last piece of the framework that I want to share with you today before we dive into the performance report is the Lake Champlain TMDL accountability framework. So I had mentioned earlier that Lake Champlain is impaired for phosphorus. We have this total maximum daily load that was put into place to identify the specific phosphorus reductions that were necessary for Lake Champlain to meet water quality standards and to resolve the cyanobacteria bloom challenges that we are faced with there. And the Environmental Protection Agency has a specific stake in overseeing our progress implementing the Lake Champlain TMDL. There is a process called the accountability framework that's built into the TMDL, where EPA, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, is checking in on our progress on a regular basis. Each year, they're checking in on how we're doing within these different watershed scales. So at a really high level, the TMDL identifies how much phosphorus reduction needs to be achieved in a 20-year implementation timeframe. But the tactical basin plans that I just walked you through in the previous slide, they serve as the implementation plans for this TMDL and break it down into 5-year increments and set interim planning targets for those 5-year increments. The basin plans identify priority actions that are needed to meet those 5-year targets. And as those actions are implemented through Claire's leadership, we track and account for those actions. And in most cases, we're able to estimate the pollution reduction or phosphorus load reductions associated with those actions. We measure our progress against the targets in the TMDL, and then we issue this performance report as a progress report to the EPA, and they use that as the basis to assess our progress implementing the TMDL. And they do that for each of these planning basins. They do it on an interim cycle, so halfway through the 5-year planning cycle, and then at the end, they issue a final report card on how we did and whether we made satisfactory progress and any other feedback they may have where we need to do more to address the goals of the TMDL. So that accountability framework is pretty critical because it means that we have checkpoints to see how we're doing, and EPA is holding us accountable to meeting these targets. So this year, the performance report contains a progress report to EPA for the Otter Creek, a final progress report at the close of the 5-year planning cycle for the Otter Creek Basin and the North Lake Champlain Basin. And then there's also an interim progress report for the Missisquoi Bay and Lamoille River basins. All right, so with that background context, I'm going to hand it over to Claire to walk you through the 2024 performance report and some of the key data takeaways. Thank you again for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emily. For the record, my name is Claire Madden, Tracking and Accounting Supervisor for the Clean Water Initiative Program. So Emily mentioned the tactical basin planning process and the identification of management actions through that process to further our clean water goals. And so I just want to share a little bit about what we mean by clean water projects. These are projects that are mostly intended to address sediment and nutrient pollution, nutrients primarily being phosphorus and nitrogen pollution. And the design of these projects generally functions to slow down and infiltrate water before it reaches our waterways and to reduce the erosive energy of large volumes of water moving across the landscape. When we're tracking and reporting on clean water projects, we categorize them into 5 primary land use sectors based on the type of non-point source pollution being addressed. And as Emily mentioned, we also think it's really important to highlight the flood resilience benefits of the clean water work that we're doing across the state, especially in light of the really devastating flooding the state has experienced in the last couple of years. We feel it's an important connection to draw that investments in clean water also provide co-benefits, one of which is climate resilience. Other co-benefits of clean water work can include improved habitat function and biodiversity, increased carbon sequestration, improved soil health, workforce development, and economic stimulus. Next slide, please. We track 4 primary categories of data to include in the report. Investments cover all state fundings awarded and spent towards clean water projects. Education measures demonstrate the scale of state-supported efforts in outreach and technical assistance to support the clean water workforce. Output measures are standardized metrics that quantify the impact of our clean water investments. And pollution reduction measures are modeled estimates of nutrient load reductions achieved through the implementation of clean water projects. For now, we're reporting on estimated phosphorus reductions in the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog basins, and in the future anticipate including estimated nitrogen reductions in the Connecticut River drainage. Now let's get into some of the data. This figure shows state investments in clean water over the reporting time frame starting in state fiscal year 2016 and running through the most recent state fiscal year 2024. The key takeaway is that the state has invested over $600 million in clean water since the beginning of this reporting effort. And as you can see right now in state fiscal year 23 and 24, we're in a pretty impressive upswing in that funding availability and funding awards being made. This is almost entirely a result of dollars made available through the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. And you can see that those investments have primarily been funneled to the wastewater and stormwater sectors, although the Agency of Agriculture did also receive a fair amount of ARPA funding to support clean water work. We report on funding as it's awarded, but the results of these investments are often not available in the same year that the funding award is made. So there's a lag time between dollars out the door and data back on the impact of those investments.
Just a quick question, we have put aside the ARPA money, so going back to like 19 and 18. We have 25 million in the clean water fund. By the way, that's dedicated. There's dedicated funding source for that, right? And that is might be what it is.
Three dedicated funding sources. It's 6 points on the rooms and meals tax, the unclaimed bottle deposits, the sheets, and there's a 0.2% property or surcharge on the property transfer tax. First $1 million of which goes to VHCB to pay off the housing bond, and the balance comes.
That's all coming back. Okay, yeah. And where do we get the rest? What does the rest of the money come from?
Sure, if we could move to the next slide, it shows funding by funding source. So Emily, yeah, thanks. So this is the same data now shown by funding source. You can see ARPA in the dark green at the bottom of the screen there, showing a large proportion of current funding availability. Other more perennial funding sources that support this work include the Capital Bill, Clean Water Fund, and Clean Water State Revolving Fund as sort of three really substantial pieces. And then you can see a couple of other categories also contributing consistently over the years.
Thank you.
So again, ARPA is playing a really large role in current funding availability. It's important to note that all the ARPA dollars that came to the state of Vermont were encumbered by the December 31st, 2024 deadline and need to be spent by the end of 2026. So while that's a huge factor in our current funding availability, it is short term and expected to decline in the coming years. Next slide, please. This slide shows one output metric from each sector. This is selected from dozens that we track and report on and are included in the full performance report. In the agricultural sector, you can see we've implemented almost 250,000 acres of agricultural conservation practices over the reporting timeframe. This is one area where we know that the data available to us in the most recent reported year is likely underrepresentative of total implementation. Each year when we run through the reporting process, we sort of reopen all of the past previously reported data and allow for filling in of data gaps. So particularly in the agricultural sector, because this reporting process runs on a state fiscal year cycle, July 1st, when the state fiscal year turns over, is right in the middle of the growing season. And so a lot of agricultural implementation hasn't yet been accounted for and will be captured in the following year reporting. In the natural resource sector, we've restored 135 acres of floodplain. The natural resource sector has more of a non-regulatory focus in terms of project implementation than some of the other sectors. And so there's some variance year to year in total implementation in the natural resource sector. This is also an area where granting cycles and reporting timeframes influence our data availability. And so again, we retroactively sort of backfill where previously there were data gaps and report on as much information as we have available each year. In the developed land sector, over 1,600 acres of existing impervious surface have been permitted to be treated with stormwater treatment practices. And this is a regulatory measure. A large majority of the work in the developed land sector, as we call it, is driven by regulations that Emily mentioned that came out of Act 64. And we do also track non-regulatory work in the developed land sector, but the increase in permits issued in state fiscal year 2024 is likely mostly driven by the 3-acre rule and issuing permits for sites that are impacted by the 3-acre rule.
Question. Okay, thank you. What specifically do you mean by impervious surface treated by stormwater treatment practices?
Yes, thank you. Great question.
Yeah, what do you do?
Impervious surface is any like non-penetrable surface.
Yeah, I know what that is.
Okay.
So what do you do to it?
So stormwater treatment practices generally catch runoff that's generated from an impervious surface and run it through some sort of treatment media. So there's several different designs depending on the site. It might look a little bit different, but a way to capture runoff and treat and remove some of the nutrients that collect in the sediment that comes along with the runoff before it flows to the Winooski River.
Could be like a rain garden.
A rain garden is a great example. Yeah, so
Retention pond. Yeah,
exactly.
Trying to
Thank
give
you.
examples.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. So
Are there efforts to
reduce the amount of impervious surfaces too. So to get rid of things, impervious surfaces that may not be necessary anymore.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's probably a piece of the puzzle, right? So in cases where impervious surface is sort of like no longer useful, removal is definitely a piece of the treatment. And returning that to a pervious land use that like a grassed area or something is a improvement from a water quality perspective.
And I could maybe just add to that. They're also, so we have a stormwater manual that we publish and update periodically that provides guidance to the consulting community about different stormwater practices. And allows them to take into account site-specific features, typically mostly soils.
Yeah.
But one of the practices are what we call pervious or permeable pavement. Those don't actually count towards a 3 acre, or for new impervious surfaces, our permitting threshold is 1 acre. And so trying to create incentives for people to look at these porous technologies, see if they're a match for how they're going to use the site. Like they aren't great if you have a lot of hard turning vehicles because they tend to tear up.
Yeah.
But if it's a good match, it may allow them to actually stay outside the regulatory system. So we're trying to create those incentives to, as Claire indicated, to reduce impervious cover. Similarly, for 3 acre sites, for sites that are very close to 3 acres, one of the recommendations is first look and see if you have unneeded impervious surfaces you could remove so that you wouldn't come under the program's purview. And have had a handful of sites that were able to make those sorts of changes. So we try to create a framework that both incentivizes folks to have a minimum amount of impervious surface necessary, and then to the extent they're sitting in a regulatory schema to look at ways to potentially reduce impervious surface in order to not be subject to those regulations.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. In the wastewater sector, work in the wastewater sector tends to be really capital intensive. So the scale of outputs that we track and report on is different in the wastewater sector. But I wanted to make note of this measure, the 27 wastewater collection systems refurbished, and the sort of increase in state fiscal year 2024 for this measure is the result of flood damage assessments that focused on identifying and repairing affected collection infrastructure. So again, drawing that connection between clean water work and flood resilience work.
Sorry. So these numbers that we're looking at that are bolded here, this is cumulative since 2016. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So not every measure that we track demonstrates an increasing trend. I think that's important to note. And in some cases, we expect a certain sort of trend curve based on a regulatory requirement or a programmatic design structure. In other cases, we've flagged the need to employ that adaptive management approach to understand where there are gaps and opportunities for programmatic development to continue furthering our progress. Next slide, please. This slide shows a couple of key takeaways from the Lake Champlain TMDL. The graph on the left side of the screen shows the TMDL baseline. This essentially is a starting point for the TMDL assessing current conditions at the time of the TMDL modeling. And the middle pie chart shows the load allocation, which represents the estimated annual loading that the system can receive while remaining within Vermont's water quality standards. The difference between these two is the pie chart on the right side of the screen, essentially that pollution reduction budget that Emily mentioned before, or the reduction goal that we're aiming to achieve through implementation of clean water work. So you can see that agriculture plays a large role in the Lake Champlain Basin, both in the baseline load and the required reductions. The natural resource sector includes both forests and streams, and also has a fairly large piece of the pie in terms of reductions to achieve. But wanted to also note the developed land sector, and that piece is an important part of reaching the TMDL target. And there may not be much opportunity to sort of swap reductions between sectors. It's important that each sector really contributes to the overall reductions that we're aiming to achieve. The purple sliver is the margin of safety. This is an added sort of buffer to the TMDL load allocation that provides some wiggle room, I'll say, for the uncertainties that are associated with loading as a result of climate change. So wanted to make note that that is factored into the TMDL modeling. And the TMDL doesn't require that we reach targets by sector, but as I mentioned, based on the scale of the work to be completed, it's really important that we're seeing reductions from all sectors. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, again.
Are we seeing reductions from all sectors?
Yeah. Yeah, so this slide shows the estimated pollution reductions in the Lake Champlain Basin that we've been able to account for so far by state fiscal year and by sector. You can see that agriculture is contributing a large proportion of estimated reductions to date. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, also the sector with the largest, I'll say, reduction target to achieve. We do expect some growth in some of the other sectors, particularly the stormwater and transportation related stormwater sectors. Those sectors the reductions are driven largely by the regulatory structure that Emily mentioned earlier. And as that sort of increasing in implementation in the coming years, we anticipate some additional reductions to account for in those sectors.
So
Yes, right.
why did we go, so I'm reading this, we went a little bit backwards in 2024. Is that because of the flooding over this summer?
I think there's another explanation on the next slide. I'd be happy to come back to your question in just a minute.
All right.
I just before getting there, I just want to mention that the phosphorus reduction data that we report on represents modeled estimates. The scale of the tracking doesn't allow for site-specific BMP monitoring across every implemented practice. So we use standardized modeled reduction efficiencies by project type to estimate the load reductions achieved across the basin. All right. I'm gonna next slide, please, Emily. I'm gonna run through the Lake Memphremagog and then get back to your question, I promise. So this set of graphs shows the same TMDL sort of takeaways for the Lake Memphremagog Basin. Again, you can see the role that agriculture plays in the target load reductions. And again, you see that margin of safety there accounting for uncertainties in loading associated with climate change. Next slide, please. And here again, the phosphorus reductions that we've estimated for the Lake Memphremagog Basin by sector and state fiscal year. I will note that the Lake Memphremagog Basin is a much smaller spatial scale. You might recall from that map we showed showing the coverage of the large-scale TMDLs across the state. The Lake Memphremagog Basin is much smaller than the Lake Champlain and has thus a smaller reduction target to achieve. All right, next slide, please, Emily.
Wait, can I just make sure I'm reading that correctly? And the previous one too, that's 17% of the total TMDL has been reduced as of state fiscal year 2024.
Correct. So in the Lake Memphremagog Basin, we have a 15.2 metric ton per year reduction target, and we've achieved 2.6 metric tons in state fiscal year 2024, which is 17% of that 15.2.
Oh, so that was 17% of what you were supposed to have done in the year?
No, of the overall target over the 20-year TMDL implementation time.
All right, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
And then when you said it that way, I was like, wait, that's not. Okay, so 17% of the overall goal has been reached as of 24.
In Memphremagog, and then in Lake Champlain, we're at about 26% of the way to our goal.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Next slide, please. So this set of graphs shows the same estimated phosphorus reduction data in the lighter purple bars, and the darker purple outlines show what we reported for estimated phosphorus reductions in last year's report. The reason that I share this graph is because it's demonstrating the effect of the data lags that I've mentioned a couple of times in what we're able to report for progress, particularly in the most recent state fiscal year. So you can see when we reported in state fiscal year 2023, the state fiscal year 23 estimated phosphorus reductions were right where Emily's cursor is right now. And this year's reporting, we were able to backfill a good amount of data from implementation that occurred in 2023, but hadn't been reported back yet. And it increased the estimated phosphorus reductions for that state fiscal year by a pretty sizable amount. So this is the first year that we've run this analysis, but we do anticipate that slight decline that's currently appearing in the data for state fiscal year 2024 may be resolved next year when we have more data available to us for the most recent year implementation.
And Senator Beck, part of the reason the team worked up this particular graphic is EPA had noted back to us in their review of our annual report that exact same thing. Like, is there a leveling off here we're seeing? And it's hard because every year it looks like there's a leveling off, right? Without benefit of the full data set from the prior year. So being able to show them on one chart and what happens when we have time, when we actually have the full data reflective of that prior year's work, felt important to communicate to this body, but also to EPA, who keeps careful tabs on this work.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think, will it get harder the closer you get? Like, is this more low hanging fruit? And in the out years, we get harder to get closer to the 100% of what you're trying to achieve.
You want to jump in back there, and I can.
Yeah, we have hypothesized that the early years of TMDL implementation really took advantage of those projects that were ready to roll and sort of, ready to hit the ground. And we're in a moment where we're investing in other aspects of clean water work to support sort of that next phase of implementation. So that includes project development work that gets projects moving along the sort of trajectory to implementation. It includes investments in the capacity of our partners to be able to do this work and to do more and more complex work in this space. So I don't think any of us have a crystal ball, but we do employ that adaptive management approach in a proactive manner to try and continue progress and fill gaps along the way, so that we don't run into an issue where we're sort of challenged at the end.
The only thing I would add to that is there's a significant set of regulatory programs that took 5 years to sort of bring into full effect. This includes particularly in the stormwater space, maybe more so than any of the other sectors reflected on that graph. And it includes the TS4 permits, the MS4 permits, and then the 3-acre stormwater permits. We're now moving into the 5-year implementation cycle for those permits. And so again, expect that due to nothing additional kind of on our end, but the requirements that exist in the regulatory space, that we will see some pretty significant increases in stormwater in particular. And then, as Claire talked about, I think particular to the natural resources sector, that sort of project development pipeline and partner support has been the team reacting to sort of some of the challenges we've heard from our partners in that space, and trying to position them to make sure we're all aligned to achieve those goals, because it is a big lift. I think, I don't know, Emily, if you're able to flip back maybe to the Lake Champlain one, like overall, we're looking for a 200 metric ton reduction, which is, high 30%, I think, from the 630 that was sort of the baseline. That's really pushing the limits of what a TMDL has been able to accomplish anywhere. And so we know that achieving these goals is going to be hard.
think Claire alluded to it in saying moving things between sectors is also hard because we've made some pretty aggressive assumptions about what each of the sectors is going to be able to contribute. And so that adaptive management approach is super important, and making sure our partners are as well positioned as possible to be successful.
So can I go back about 30,000 feet? So there's two sides of the lake. There's two sides of Lake Magog. So are these goals only for Vermont, or is it looking at the lake from the EPA's standpoint of having control? What about New York State?
Yeah.
They have their own plan? Okay.
Yes, they have their own. So New York State, Vermont, and Quebec are all party to the Lake Champlain TMDL, but each entity has a distinct target and plan in place to implement. So we're reporting on just the Vermont segments of the Lake Champlain Basin here, and same goes for Magog.
Because my constituents, a lot of them are farmers. I grew up on a farm, I worked on farms my whole life. And farmers can see New York State still can spread manure in the wintertime. We can. So I have to answer those questions when they ask me. Can you explain that?
Yeah, and it is just as Claire said, that each jurisdiction has their own approach to achieving our part of a target that will ultimately should lead to the water quality results we all want to see. And then there are coordinating committees that help ensure that alignment. So the Lake Champlain Basin Program, and then there's a Lake Magog Steering Committee that both involve sort of representatives from each of the jurisdictions, so that we are in regular communication about our work and challenges we need.
So I've been told that anecdotally that there's geographically, the farms in New York State, the streams don't contribute so much to the TMDL as Vermont's do. And I just wonder if that's accurate.
The modeling that was done for the Lake Champlain TMDL, it's estimated that about 70% of the loading to Lake Champlain is from Vermont. And so the amount of implementation that we're doing and the targets we've set for the Vermont side is proportionate with our contribution to the phosphorus loading to the lake. But of course, there's still actions that are needed across New York and Quebec as well. And Secretary Moore mentioned some of the collaborative approaches. And I'll just add also that in 2026, there is a commitment to reopen the targets for New York and Vermont and to kind of renegotiate what that split looks like. So that'll be a moment in time where some of these questions can be asked and to check on the proportionate efforts across the different jurisdictions.
Okay, I'm gonna follow up.
Sure. Yeah.
So I know agricultural processes, and don't get me wrong, you guys have done a great job with this. I think, and I know how important it is, but when we have a significant weather event, a lot of times the wastewater treatment facilities can't sustain any more capacity, and the gates get open into the river. Have you calculated how much that actually contributes to the TMDL?
We have. So I think you're referring to largely combined sewer overflows, which are, when they call them intentional releases, as opposed to during an extreme weather event like the 23 storms. I know Middlebury had some issues with their wastewater facility, but that's just a reflection of the extreme weather. We do calculate those, and that contribution tends to be very small compared to sort of day in, day out wastewater operations. Say nothing of agricultural operations. If you look at the graph Emily's got displayed up here, that dark blue wedge is wastewater. And my understanding is that wedge accounts for combined sewer overflows.
And I'll just add, if it's okay, we do report in the full performance report, we report on the measured contributions of phosphorus from wastewater treatment facilities to the lake. And so this in this middle figure, 33.1 metric tons per year is sort of the permitted maximum for all discharges from wastewater treatment facilities to the lake. The measured load from the permit compliance perspective is far below that permitted total every year that we collect the data. So while that's sort of an allowance, we could, get up to that amount. We're currently contributing much less than that from wastewater treatment facilities to the lakes.
Thank you.
All right, next. To the Clean Water Interactive Dashboard slide, please, Emily. All right, so that's all the data that I had prepared to share with you all today, but I wanted to share this resource, which is an online interactive dashboard that contains all of the data compiled for the report each year and allows for some investigation and filtering of the data based on a particular area of interest or a sector. So if you'd like to see more of the data behind the report, it is available there. I know we're getting up to time, so I want to be conscious of that. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to make note of the folks that are behind all of the work that we report on. Our Clean Water Network is a diverse set of partners across the state and beyond that support the implementation of this work. And so we collect data for this reporting from the Agency of Administration, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, Agency of Natural Resources, and Agency of Transportation, along with the Lake Champlain Basin Program, USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. That's over 50 programs administered by state agencies and affiliates that are supporting a really broad range of clean water work across scales, sectors, and geographies of the state. So all of this reporting that we're able to do is really thanks to the administration of all of those programs that support this work and support our partners in doing this work. Next slide, please. If it's okay, I'll just end with a couple of project highlights. These pictures are agricultural practice implementation from state fiscal year 2024. The picture on the left shows a grass filter strip that was installed along both sides of a river. You can see that sort of tree line running through the middle of the picture is actually a river. And so this grass filter strip on either side of the river, separating the agricultural fields from the water body, helps to capture soil and nutrient runoff and prevent it from entering the waterways. Filter strips are really effective in protecting water quality, and this project was supported through the Agency of Agriculture's Grass Waterway and Filter Strip Program in collaboration with the Orleans County Natural Resource Conservation District. On the right-hand side of the screen is a barnyard improvement and cover that was installed through Agency of Agriculture's Best Management Practice Program. The national organic standards require that animals have access to the outdoors every day, but access to the outdoors introduces the possibility of animal waste combining with rainfall and runoff. So adding the covers to these outdoor spaces for animals helps to protect water quality while also providing humane conditions for our farm animals. Next slide, please. This set of pictures is a before on the left and an after on the right of a culvert crossing removal, ditch plug installation, and road decommissioning on a former agricultural field where these restoration practices were implemented to restore natural conditions as part of the farm's retirement. This project is located in Morgan, Vermont. And phase 1 of the work was completed in the spring of 2024. Phase 2 of the work is currently ongoing. Just want to note all of the organizations that were involved in this work, which included the Orleans County Natural Resource Conservation District, the Memphremagog Watershed Association, and Northwood Stewardship Center, as well as support from the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Agency of Agriculture, and the Nature Conservancy all played a role in helping to implement this project. And the funding for the work was provided by a Clean Water Initiative Program Water Quality Restoration Formula Grant that was awarded to the Memphremagog Watershed Association from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, serving in their role as the Memphremagog Clean Water Service Provider. The Nature Conservancy also contributed funding to the project and is a co-holder of the easement. And the reason that I make note of this is because that's a lot of people, a lot of partners involved, a lot of funding sources. And so it just demonstrates that, you know, this became sort of one number in our reporting, but it really represents a major effort and a lot of impactful work that was able to proceed through partnerships in our network.
We have a question.
Thank you. So can you describe what you did here? Because it looks like you took out or whomever took out a culvert.
Yes.
Is that the major thing? So you're basically getting rid of a source point.
Yes, so this picture shows the culvert removal, and you can kind of see some tire tracks here in the field. That was an old farm road that was decommissioned. So by removing the culvert and sort of renaturalizing the surface, it restored some more natural conditions that reduce erosive tendencies in that system. So as that river flows, there's not a constriction point and thus not an increase in velocity that causes erosion.
Okay, we have another question.
Can you go back
If
to the
you're-
previous slide?
If you're done, Senator Hardy, two questions.
Yeah, I think. And what's the second part? You said this was phase one. What's the second?
I would have to check back on what's happening. No, I apologize. I just, this project includes a lot of different components. So I don't want to misspeak on it.
No, that's fine.
So
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
What crop is that planted in the riparian area?
I don't know the answer to that. That would be a great question for our friends at the
I'm just
agency.
wondering if it was something that was harvested.
I think generally they are allowed to plant like a hay crop,
Mhm.
but it has to be something that's permanent vegetation.
Right, is probably highly erodible soil.
Correct, correct. And sometimes I know in other instances, farmers have planted them with a crop that can be used for bedding as opposed to animal feed.
one further question. If you can go back one more slide. Actually, one more beyond that. The interact. So I'm not on it digitally right now, but I'm hoping that this is an interactive, like that's a link, so I can get to this.
Yes,
In fact,
the QR code and right behind
okay.
Emily should work, and the underlined text is also a hyperlink. So you should have
Cool.
it in the presentation slides.
Super. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Emily, if we could go to the last slide, please. I'll just wrap up a few concluding thoughts. So as Emily mentioned earlier, this report serves as one tool in assessing our progress and informing management planning and what more needs to be done in order to reach our goals. We're doing a lot of impactful work, and some of that might be underrepresented in the data that we have available to report, especially in the most recent years. We also have a lot of money going out the door, and some of that, the impacts and outcomes of that investment will be reflected in future years of reporting. Because of the volume of financial support that's available to clean water in this moment, we really need to support the growth in the capacity of our network. So we're doing that through several investments. The Clean Water Initiative Program, Agency of Ag, and Lake Champlain Basin Program all have capacity initiatives to support the development and growth of our network of partners that are doing this work to ensure that they're numerous, diverse, well-trained, and well-resourced. As we've mentioned a couple of times, there's state regulatory programs that are really moving into implementation this year, and we'll expect to see the results of that reflected in estimated phosphorus reductions reported in future years. Funding programs are shifting to a regionalized structure that relies on our partners to administer funding of individual projects. This was done in order to support scaling the investments to meet that funding availability that we're currently seeing. But we also recognize that this represents a learning curve for a lot of entities that are acting in a new capacity across the state. And so scaling the investments will take some time for our clean water workforce to be able to catch. And we're continuing to expand our work in implementing the tracking and accounting procedures that we use to estimate phosphorus reductions in the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog basins. As we do that, we expect a more complete picture of progress on the ground, and we'll continue to use that adaptive management approach to assess the data that's available and identify gaps and increase inform planning and programmatic development to address those gaps.
Great. All right, super. Thank you very much. Thank you. I have a couple. Well, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to mention, here's another link to the Clean Water Interactive Dashboard there. So,
thank you. I apologize for the. I feel like this is like a bummer of a question, but we know that we've had a lot of great work that's been done. I mean, from the program over the years, and we had a wonderful like spike in that work because of ARPA, and now that money is going away. Can you just speak to like how you anticipate the program changing as a result of the lack of ARPA money? And maybe have we built capacity that now, you know, there's not going to be money to do that work? Like, how do you see the next few years playing out?
great question. I'll start, and then I think Emily will probably have more to add. So I will note that ARPA, I mentioned the ARPA encumbrance deadline of the end of 2024. There are some other really large federal funding initiatives that we anticipate being reflected in future years of reporting, including the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, both which have money moving to clean water work. And in addition to that, and what I'll let Emily speak on a bit more, I know the Clean Water Board was really intentional about planning for the availability of ARPA and avoiding sort of a drop off in funding availability that would put partners in exactly the situation that you described. So maybe I'll turn it to Emily to say more on that.
Sure, that's an excellent question. And I think that ARPA funds were strategically invested in large part in the regulatory sector, addressing some of the more capital intensive wastewater treatment facility projects, community wastewater, on-site wastewater, and also a great deal of it's going into the 3-acre general permit. And we're in the process of developing, if it's authorized in this current year budget, financing structure to support that would leverage some seed funding from the Clean Water Fund, but also potentially Clean Water State revolving funds. So for the most part, we try to really program the ARPA funds as like a short-term funding source to avoid impact on those core programs that we really rely on to provide stability over the TMDL implementation period. And a lot of the funding that has been prioritized by the legislature as a top tier is going into those non-regulatory programs like the water quality enhancement grants and the water quality restoration formula grants. And we're really targeting a lot of the organizational capacity building in that sector because we rely on those community-based partners to do that project development, the community engagement, so that those projects can be implemented on the ground. Those are actions that are not compelled by regulation, so that level of capacity building is really critical. And so we've designed those funds to be more stable, and less of the short-term funding has been programmed into those sectors. So we hope that will help to kind of minimize the impact of that drop-off in funding, but then continuing to also, where we can, like Claire mentioned, leverage federal funding opportunities that are currently here or possibly on the horizon, and pairing the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which is a really long-standing resource in the state of Vermont, but looking at where that can also have more creative uses to support some other project types that they traditionally haven't been used for, such as floodplain restoration, other natural resource related projects. Secretary Moore, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think some of like the opposite of what you're maybe at, Senator Watson, is reflected in. You didn't see the same scale up in investments in agriculture, and many of those agricultural practices are annual practices, right? Things like cover cropping, conservation tillage that have to be replicated year after year. And so as Emily and Claire described, we really did try to work to be strategic and direct those ARPA funds into infrastructure investments where there's an entity then that's well positioned to operate and maintain. We're able to fund that upfront capital investment with these one-time federal dollars. And then there's somebody well positioned to operate and maintain that system. That's great.
Thank you. That's fabulous. And so there's two questions about, we'll go with Senator Hardy then to.
Okay, thank you. I just am hoping you guys can come back and do a more in-depth presentation. And I already mentioned this on the 3-acre rule. Where I think all of us are getting emails and questions from constituents about it, and I'd like to understand it more. I don't really fully understand what it is.
We're happy to, and it probably will be a somewhat different team. I mean, Emily and Claire are able to talk about some of the financial supports for providing the 3-acre property owners. But in reality, I think you probably want to hear from the 3-acre or from the stormwater program.
Sure.
We can talk
Whoever
about
it is,
but
I need to understand it better.
yeah, and I guess I hope the takeaway from today is the context that those reductions that the 3-acre program is set up to achieve are critical to our overall goals. And happy to talk about and hear more about the challenges folks are seeing on the ground as we work to do those projects.
Yeah, this was helpful to understand that it's part of this bigger thing. But I would love to know how it's actually working.
Yeah, we're happy to.
I don't even know what to say to people when they email me. So, thank you.
Senator Williams.
Great minds think alike. So I know you, Secretary, said that we're going into 5-year planning. Do we have results of how many properties are on the 3-acre list that actually complied and attempted to get the permitting applications in?
I will talk in very broad strokes, but there were about 700 properties in total that were required to obtain permit coverage. My understanding is about 500 of them have applied for permit coverage or submitted what we call a notice of intent, meaning they are in our regulatory system. And then just over 200 have actually pulled a permit to begin the construction of whatever those stormwater practices are. Another initiative that's being run out of the Clean Water Initiative program's work is around what we're calling our Green Schools Initiative. But it's providing funding. Many high schools, as you might imagine, were picked up in this 3-acre campus, or picked up as 3-acre campuses. And so we have created funding to cover up to 90% of the cost for schools and for manufactured housing communities at this point. And there are a handful of other projects where a property owner was planning to do some sort of redevelopment, and obviously stormwater management improvements are much more cost effective when big yellow machines are on site anyway. And so we have had a number of folks that have gone through implementation because they already had another project planned.
Because this has been on my radar since about 2015.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was part of the Act 64. We had proposed some changes in 2017 or 2018 that weren't supported by the General Assembly, and sort of moved into standing up the regulatory program as it exists today.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
This is so much fun. In 2015 was my first year here, and that was when we did this whole bill. And so a lot of this stuff I wasn't on the committee of jurisdiction, but so a lot of the stuff, it's just nice to see progress, since then. I think that.
No, I know this is such a long-term commitment, right? And staying with something in 20 years that doesn't produce those immediate intangible results, I know it's hard, but just the quality of the work and the data that the team is able to assemble to document what it is we're doing, I think hope gives all of you confidence that we are being very thoughtful in how we are making these investments and really driving the kind of water that was envisioned by Act 64.
Yes, go ahead.
So we're measuring what's going into the lake in the ways that we can links, in the way that we're reducing what's going in or the waterways in the basins. Are we seeing in Champlain and Memphremagog, comes up just like, I'm sure it's more complicated than this question, but testing the quality of the water, are we actually seeing palpable improvements as a result of everything we're doing? I know we're able to measure that we're putting in less, which ought to suggest,
Right.
but I'm just wondering if that's actually translating.
Sure, I could start, and then Emily or Claire, if you want to jump in. So this is probably what I see as the most
foundational component of our relationship with the Lake Champlain Basin Program, right? They coordinate a long-term monitoring program that ensures that Vermont, New York, and Quebec all collect data the same way. So we have a single data set and can look at the lake. They publish every 3 years something called the State of the Lake Report, and we can provide a link to that. The most recent one was able to actually show some fairly significant downward trends in Missisquoi Bay. So one of the first sort of signals we're seeing. I think our ability to see those trends is challenged by weather. The last 2 years probably being case in point. It's a noisy system. As Emily and Claire spoke to, most of our pollution is being driven by weather events. And so when the weather is extra noisy, it's even harder to see what's going on in the lake. The U.S. Geologic Survey a couple of years ago now, maybe 3 years ago now, did an evaluation, which was essentially, if it rained the same every year, how would things look? So it's another modeled exercise. But they were able to show for most of the major tributaries, there would be a downward trend, and it's being masked by noisy weather. We know ultimately our success is achieving the in-lake water quality standards, right? But having those modeled results that show us that the work we're doing it appears to be having the desired effect are really important. And then that piece from the basin program around Missisquoi Bay was also really heartening, because that's one of our probably most challenging pieces of this larger body of work. If you want to add.
If I could add one more thing, chapter 6 of the report does include an acknowledgement of sort of the other factors influencing in-lake water quality, one of which particularly in Lake Champlain is legacy phosphorus. So we're sort of rewriting a long history of land management that contributed a lot of phosphorus to the lake and is now largely settled in the lakebed sediments, which can in some instances in the right conditions cause what's called internal loading. And so that, along with the lag times associated with implementing some of these practices, the effectiveness of the practice itself is maybe fully realized years after the implementation, the construction is done. So those two factors also contribute to sort of this long lead time and in seeing the in-lake results that we're hoping or we're aiming for.
Let's go way back to the very beginning of this, but I remember that there was an appropriation. I think it was like, $1 million is small. And it was for, basically prizes for anybody that can come up with a way of actually pulling phosphorus out of the lake. It was, did any of that ever come to anything?
Yeah, so the Phosphorus Innovation Challenge, and that was early on in Governor Scott's administration. And there were a couple of projects. So we had 25 applicants. We picked, I want to say 8 for seed funding, and then ultimately 3 were advanced to more significant funding. One of them resulted in what I would call like Foster Brothers North. So it's a large composting operation, not dissimilar to Moodoo and Middlebury, being run off of the Magnan farm in Fairfield. They actually are coupled up with a second winner, which was a micro filtering technology that's able to sort of produce a concentrated phosphorus fertilizer out of manure. And they use that, they mix that liquid in with some of the compost to create something that's good for starting seeds. And then a third project, so that one, those 2 are up and running. We have a third project that ultimately couldn't be made to succeed. Still hopeful somebody will pick it up and run with it, which was, there was a treatment unit on the end of a manure digester on the Blue Spruce farm in Bridgeport. And it's called dissolved air flotation, and it's fine bubbles are pumped into the digested manure, and all the tiny solids rise to the top and can be scraped off. Those solids have, I want to say, like 60% of all the phosphorus in the manure. Like it's an unbelievable amount. And there had been a team from UVM and a couple of other organizations that was looking at what you could do with these the fines that get scraped off the top. The problem that they were unable to overcome is they set up like cement, literally.
Oh, okay.
And so I gone a couple of things, grad students working on it with like really industrial food processors. And I thought, I wonder how that's gonna scale.
Yeah, okay.
And the answer was
Couldn't scale
they
it.
couldn't scale it. It was unbelievably successful in the grow trials. And so I hold out hope that somebody will figure out a way to
Turn it into bricks or something or.
well, or to pulverize the
Yeah.
material. I mean, the whole premise of the Phosphorus Innovation Challenge is each year we continue to import more phosphorus, right? We've got
Yeah.
this team doing all the work on the back end, but we're bringing it in food that we feed ourselves. We're bringing it in food we feed cows. We're bringing it in fertilizer and peat moss. And so if there are opportunities to sort of reduce how much new phosphorus we're
Right.
bringing in, it would be great. So the composting operation is up and running in Fairfield. And then, as I say, it was a great disappointment, but we just couldn't figure
Couldn't
out a
figure
way.
out, okay, all right.
Not yet. But I suspect
Yeah.
it showed enough promise in terms of seed trials that there are probably people still trying to figure that one out.
Great. Super. Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you for having
Yeah.
us and happy to find the time to come back on. Thank you.
Okay, let's do it.